I want to move to the general foreign policy now under Trump. I'm not sure if you've seen the national security strategy, the report that came out last week.
Yeah.
That was a bit of a surprise. A lot of people freaked out, especially in Europe. But the approach, obviously, they were very critical of Europe. The free speech crackdown we've seen in Europe, it's talked about the death of European identity. I think they used the word civilization erasure. And about European defense spending not being enough. But now the way they've positioned Russia and China, they've positioned China not as an enemy, but more of an economic rival, which I think is the right way to see China if you want a world of peace. And they've also talked about how Europe is really obsessing over Russia as an enemy, and that's not really justified. Talks about the European economy versus the Russian economy, the European military military spending versus Russia, and that Russia's really not a threat to Europe. At least not in the way that Europeans see it. What do you make of the national security strategy? Because I do know in just a few weeks ago, he said that Trump, and on a few occasions, you did say that Trump is not serious about peace in Ukraine. So maybe start with the general strategy under the Trump administration. You could talk about the national security strategy, and then slowly move into Ukraine and what you think of Trump's recent efforts with Witkoff and Kushner going to meet Putin.
Well, there's no denying that there is a change in attitude reflected in the current draft, what was published for the 2025 National Security Strategy. However, I challenge anybody that's reading you, following you on Twitter, on X, anyone in the entire universe, go back and tell me what the National Security Strategy was under Joe Biden that was released in 2023. Tell me what it was under Donald Trump, which was released, I believe, in 2017. What was it under Barack Obama? What I'm simply illustrating by that is these documents are produced. They're nice words on paper, but they are not blueprints. This is not like China. When China puts together a 5-year plan, by God, they do a 5-year plan. They hold people accountable. We're going to do this, and we're going to do this, and this is what we want. And they, because you look at what China is today, it is what it is today because of past planning, where those planning documents actually reflect government policy. Not so with the national security strategies that are put out by every president early in their administration. It's supposedly a guideline of what they're going to do. But I always like to see what are they actually going to do. Now, I think the important signals to take away from this one is the United States has done the equivalent of going to Europe. It's like a couple that have been dating for a while, and they say, you know what? I think it's time to start seeing other people. And Europe is like, oh, my God, we're upset. We're getting a divorce. Yeah, that's where it's headed. But it's headed in that direction for a very simple reason. What does Europe have to offer? Europe once was the center of the Industrial Revolution. Europe was once the center of science and technology, with the likes of Isaac Newton and Galileo and then Einstein. It was a happening place, cutting edge. Financial, it was certainly a financial center for the world. And it really continues trying to hold on to that. But in terms of natural resources, nothing. In terms of holding on to a cultural heritage, I think the national security strategy correctly identifies that problem. Because, for most of the last 500 years, until really the last 30 years, Europe was really what you'd consider a Christian segment. And unfortunately for being Christians, they certainly didn't live up to the ideals of Jesus, because the colonial empires that came out of Europe that ravaged Central and South America, that ravaged Africa, that ravaged Asia, we never saw a single colony overseas that was Russian or Chinese. They didn't do that. That was a European thing. Go out, conquer, take away. So I can see the United States now, it's wisely distancing itself from Europe because Europe no longer really matters, which is, shocking to Europe. but that is the actual reality. So,
do you think the US is distancing itself or just asking Europe to really step up, especially when it comes to Ukraine? Because they're criticizing Europe. If you don't care about someone, you really don't spend too much time criticizing them. You only criticize your friends. You don't criticize a stranger walking on the street, even if they're doing things wrong or saying stupid things. So if you're telling Europe, hey, you really got to stop the censorship, you really got to increase defense spending, you really have to fucking figure out, sorry for cursing, you have to figure out the immigration policy in your country. Doesn't that show that the US is just giving, its little brother a big wake-up call?
Well, the Europeans still look upon the United States with disdain. I mean, we're Johnny-come-latelys. The fact that we saved their bacon at the end, the way the narrative works in the West, we saved their bacon at the end of World War II. Now, the reality was the Soviet Union saved the West by defeating the Germans. The West did play a role in helping divert some German resources to the West, but it was largely a victory brought about by the Soviet Army. But out of that, United States, it gained the economic and political dominance. And notice that, like the war in Vietnam, that grew out of U.S. effort to help the French retain a colonial empire, which when the French got beat at the Dien Bien Phu, that was sort of the end of that. And the United States stepped in to take over. But I don't see really a foundation for the kind of warm relationships that once existed. Let's not forget the British MI6. British GCHQ, their signal intercept intelligence outfit, they played a major role in Russiagate, in spying on members of Donald Trump's team, passing that intelligence to the Central Intelligence Agency and to the National Security Agency and to the FBI, intelligence that was used to target individuals like George Papadopoulos and others. So, I think that sort of hangs over particularly the U.S.-British relationship. There's no foundation. I mean, you step back and say, what does the UK have to offer the United States or France or Germany for that matter? Nothing. There's nothing they produce that the United States needs. Where ironically, the United States sure needs the fertilizer that is produced out of Russia. And it needs, to a lesser extent, but still needs somewhat the uranium that has been processed by Russia for fueling nuclear power plants. So there's much more natural economic affinity now between the United States and Russia than there is between the United States and the UK.
It needs to move Russia outside China's grip as well. Strategically very important in that rivalry, no?
Yeah, well, that's been the dream, the dream of Elbridge Colby and others. You go back and look at the RAND studies that were produced on this 3-4 years ago. Yeah, they kept saying, "Oh, there's no way that Russia's just going to be a redheaded stepchild, sort of a hanger-on, and China's just going to overwhelm it." What I have seen and heard, it shows that this relationship between Russia and China is genuine, it's deep, and it's not one of imbalance where China is so dominant and Russia is subservient. One of the leading voices in Russia for this, and I don't know if when you were there with us in March, if you ever had a chance to meet and talk with Sergei Karaganov. If you haven't, I'd encourage you to see if you could get an interview with him. I'd be happy to help you do that. Karaganov is a leading political thinker. He chaired the discussion, moderated the discussion with President Putin at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. I know in 2024, and I think he did the same again in 2025. He has been a long advocate that Russia's future lies in the East, not in the West, and that working in a line with China. And many in the West, particularly Donald Trump, forget that during World War II, China actually fought 70% of the Japanese army, which was deployed onto mainland China. And the Soviet Union was providing significant support to the Chinese, not just the communists, but to the Kuomintang, to Chiang Kai-shek's folks. So, that goes back to this war. And, both countries share that in common, that they lost tremendous numbers. Between Russia and China, the total killed in World War II, they accounted for about 70% of all people killed in World War II. Just those two countries. So they paid with their blood. They remember. And so this is the West thinks foolishly that it can split off Russia from China. In fact, that was one of the Rand Corporation's stated objectives, that if they could get a war started with Ukraine and Russia, and that if Ukraine defeated Russia, then Russia would be forced to come to the Western side and work with the West in weakening China. Well,
Ukraine defeated Russia.
Yeah, if that was the plan.
But how does that make sense? How could they expect Ukraine to defeat Russia when Russia invaded Ukraine, everyone expected Ukraine to fall within a few days?
Yeah, well, that was before. So this was published in like 2019 by Rand Corporation,
okay,
or 2020, and what was his name? A. Owen Mitchell. He wrote a paper for the Pentagon, basically mirroring what the Rand Corporation did, that appeared in December of 2020. And the thought was that the West would build up Ukraine, would make Ukraine militarily strong enough, and then with Western support, Ukraine would be in a position to defeat Russia, because they grossly underestimated Russia's military capability. And then once Russia was defeated, Russia would be forced to turn to the West. Again, that was what sort of their hope, their Christmas wish list. Well, it didn't turn out that way. And it's had just the opposite effect in terms of bringing Russia and China together.
How do you think the war has turned out? Because at the beginning, everyone expected Ukraine to fall within a few days. Ukraine's population is 90% that of Russia, if not below. 10% that of Russia.
Yeah.
So Ukraine did not fall within the first few days. It did fight back Russia. There was a pretty successful counter-offensive going on. And then throughout the last couple of years, every month someone's coming out with a theory that Ukraine's going to fall, Ukraine's going to capitulate, but Ukraine's still fighting. They're losing territory. They've just lost or about to lose Pokrovsk, but they're still fighting, and they're causing pretty significant damage to. Significant is obviously subjective depending who you ask, but they're causing damage to Russia, deep strikes into Russia. There's been a report that just came out as well by the IEA that I think came out yesterday. It said Russia's oil and fuel export revenue was $11 billion in November, which is the lowest monthly total since the invasion began. It's $3.6 billion below November last year. So it's a drop of 30% or so. So I'm not, obviously Ukraine, I wouldn't say is winning the war, but it's not capitulating either. What do you make of the state of the war, at least on the battlefield?
Well, what you've repeated, and this is not a criticism of you, it's natural. What you've repeated is largely the Western narrative, but it's a false narrative. So let's go back to 2022, to the start of the special military operation. When Russia invaded, we'll call it an invasion, when they went into Ukraine, they went in with between 125,000 and 180,000 troops. Now, the current line of contact is over 1,300 kilometers. If you use the Battle of Stalingrad as an example, in the Battle of Stalingrad, along a front that was about 40 kilometers long from north to south, Russia employed over 1 million troops in that. So Russia is using 1/10 the number of troops that it used in World War II against Stalingrad, against an entire length of this line of contact, so-called. Russia's early objective was to compel Ukraine to negotiate. Ukraine started with a ground force of around 300,000. And Russia's total ground forces at the time were about 350,000. So Russia essentially committed about 50%. But never did they entertain they're going to conquer Ukraine. I mean, physically impossible. They didn't have enough troops to do that. They wanted to use the military pressure to get Ukraine to negotiate, which it succeeded. The negotiations took place in Istanbul. And as you know, you and I were there with Lavrov, where he talked about this, that the document that was brought to the table was brought by Ukraine. And the Russians checked off on, okay, there were some negotiations on it, but basically they could live with it because it was going to keep Donetsk and Luhansk within Ukraine. It was going to reduce the Ukrainian army to 85,000. NATO was going to be out. And then what happened? Boris Johnson and Joe Biden intervened and pushed him out. And at that point, I think when you hosted the debate between Danny Davis and Ben Hodges, Danny Davis made the correct observation that the Russian general staff went in with a plan A. They didn't have a plan B to fall back on. Now, once the peace talks fell apart and the Ukrainians immediately called up 900,000 reservists, they had basically a 1 million man army up against a 300,000 man Russian ground force. The Russians only partially mobilized in September. But note that in May of 2022, Russia captured Mariupol, and they marched on it. And at no point when they had Mariupol surrounded did you see Ukraine mount a counter-offensive with sufficient military force to drive through the Russian lines to save their colleagues who were surrounded. Ultimately, the members of the Azov battalion surrendered. So it wasn't until September of 2022 when the Russians said, okay, we're going to have a partial mobilization. They've got a minimum of 5 million reservists that they can mobilize, but they only mobilized 320,000. The rest were handled by recruits, conscripts to the tune of about 35,000 a month, and then contract soldiers. So over the course of the last 3.5 years, Russia's military, which was ground force 300,000 back in February 2022, is now around 1.5 million, which is why now we're seeing Russia rapidly advance all along the front. Previous Russian tactics had two objectives: limit civilian casualties, and you can compare the limited number of civilians killed in the Ukraine-Russia conflict with those that the Israelis are killing in Gaza. I mean, no comparison. That's why what's going on in Gaza can be correctly called a genocide. Russia also used tactics where they did not employ mass wave assaults, despite some claims in the West. And so how do we know this? Well, we actually have two metrics that we can follow. One is social media is not sanctioned or censored heavily in either Russia or Ukraine. And in Ukraine, you see cemetery after cemetery after cemetery, line upon line of new graves being dug. You're not seeing that. You see a few graves, but you don't see it on the scale. The second metric, exchange of bodies. Since January of this year, Russia and Ukraine are exchanging cadavers of soldiers who have been picked up on the battlefield. The ratio right now is for every dead Russian that's returned to the Russian side, the Russians are returning 38 dead Ukrainians. Now, this is where you get into the hypocrisy. So the Ukrainian side and the Ukrainian supporters say, well, that's just because the Russians are advancing and the Ukrainians don't have time to pick up the bodies. Yeah, that's right. Say that again. The Russians are advancing and the Ukrainians don't have time to pick up the bodies. That means Russia is winning on that account. But then there's a third metric, and it's a group in the UK who are actually pro-Ukrainian. But what they do is they monitor all of the obituary notices across all of the oblasts or the republics in Russia. And their current estimate stands at between 160 and 200,000 dead Russians over the course since February 2022. I think that's largely an accurate number. By contrast, the West refuses to look at the numbers of what's going on with Ukraine, but I come back to the body counts exchanged.
But on the body counts exchange, I think you made the point that Russia is advancing, but also you've also confirmed that this is why Russia has more Ukrainian bodies. So using the 1 to 38 ratio is, I'm not saying it's not an indicator we could use whatsoever, but it's also an indicator that it is impacted by the reality on the ground because Russia is advancing. But that's why it's hard. Like what I struggle with, Larry, is whoever I speak to. If I speak to someone on the Russian side or someone on the Ukrainian side, it's really difficult to get the right figures, the casualty figures.
Sure.
Even the reality on the ground, it's hard to debate that Russia is advancing. But Pokrovsk has fallen. Pokrovsk has not fallen. Pokrovsk has fallen, for last month. Even that is really hard to verify. But there's one thing on the Ukrainian side, and I think the Ukraine is struggling, militarily. I think everyone agrees that they're not able to get enough men. European and American support for Ukraine is shaky, to say the least. But it has been 4 years. And Russia, part of the negotiations right now, the 28-point peace plan, then became 19, now again, I think 28, is Ukraine has to give up the Donbass. And the Russia has not been able to control the entirety of Donetsk yet. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that is? Do you think that is intentional by Russia as part of war of attrition? Or do you think that Ukraine is putting up a good fight with the European and American weapons?
Well, they're putting, Ukraine is putting up a hellacious fight back. They're a NATO proxy. And I'm always amused with, you had Ben Hodges on. If you get David Petraeus, get Admiral Stavridis, get any of these American generals, they always, look down their nose at how bad the Russians are. But tell you what, guys, Americans fought a bunch of goat herders in Afghanistan for 21 years or 20 years. Those goat herders didn't have, Russian intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capabilities. They didn't have Russian artillery, Russian tanks, Russian RPGs, Russian drones. They had none of that. The United States had all of that. And what happened? We got beat. We had to retreat. What's happening with Russia? And I've spoken to several different, both enlisted and senior officers, General Abdi Aludinov being one of them. There were restrictions imposed on the Russians to, one, limit the killing of civilians. Some of them described it as that the Russian army had its hands tied behind its back. It could not fight full out. Number two, they're not fighting foreigners per se, because the Ukrainians are Russian as far as the Russians are concerned. And people say, oh, that's nonsense. Really? General Syrskyi, head of the Ukrainian army. Do you know where his parents live? Russia. His parents, think about this, his parents are drawing retirement pensions from the Russian government. And has the Russian government locked them up? Oh, they're free. They live their lives without being persecuted, because you've got Ukrainians married to Russians, Russians married to Ukrainians. This is really closer to what was the American Civil War, where you had brothers fighting brothers, cousins fighting cousins.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've heard stories where couples were broken up throughout the war. The girlfriend's stuck in Ukraine, the boyfriend's stuck in Russia. I think vice versa, boyfriend in Ukraine and girlfriend in Russia. So going back to the reality on the ground, what does that mean for the negotiations right now that are ongoing? So we know the 28-point peace plan from memory, obviously on the ground, Donbass, Zaporizhia, Kherson, Russia, it's non-negotiable. At least Kherson is up.
Yeah.
The Donbass non-negotiable. Kherson, Zaporizhia freeze the lines where they are today. Ukraine is looking for some sort of security guarantees. We're just not sure how those would look like. I think the initial plan included, it's a very weird plan. The first one is said there'll be European, not American, but European jets, fighter jets in Poland.
Right.
Which was a bit weird because there's already NATO jets, European NATO jets in Poland. So it's a bit of weird security guarantee. But obviously Ukraine would not be joining NATO. That was part of the original plan. And then Ukraine, at least Europe, responded with some sort of guarantees, like an Article 5-like guarantee they were asking from the US. What do you think those negotiations would lead to, and how hopeful are you? And what do you think the terms would look like? Because also Ukraine sent their response recently, and they seem to be in a pretty tricky position. I think Zelensky was asking for some sort of truce on striking energy infrastructure because of the blackouts that Ukraine is facing. So it seems that Zelensky now is more open to a peace deal than what we saw in Istanbul. What do you think that would lead to?
The Russian terms are very simple. They were outlined by Vladimir Putin on June 14th, 2024, in a speech to the Russian Foreign Ministry senior officials. Number one, Crimea, Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk, and Luhansk are now and forever permanently part of the Russian Republic. That's not up for negotiation. There's no part of Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk that's going to be ceded or allowed to stand under Ukrainian control. The Russian demand is Ukraine must withdraw its forces from those republics. That's Russian territory before negotiations begin. Okay, this is not to be negotiated. This is what the Russian demand is. That's what much Ukraine must do if they want to enter negotiations. Second, there must be an election in Ukraine at which there is a legitimately elected president. The Russians insist that Volodymyr Zelensky is no longer legitimate because he didn't hold the elections when they were supposed to be held. He basically declared martial law and installed himself as sort of the permanent president. The easiest way out of this is for the Rada to select I think his name is Stefanchuk, as a successor to Putin or a successor to Zelensky, and then to hold elections within 90 days. Then Russia will talk to Ukraine. That's got to, because they got to have somebody that, from the Russian perspective, can legally carry out a decision. Go ahead.
But just on the Zaporizhia and Kherson, you're saying that the Russian terms, at least even now, is not to freeze the lines. He's saying it's non-negotiable that freezing the lines right now is Zaporizhia and Kherson. Do you think anything would happen? Because the initial 28-point plan, including freezing the lines, you said Russia would not accept that?
Yeah, wouldn't accept that at all. And it's not like Putin doesn't have the ability, the legal authority to make that agreement, because it is now constitutionally part of Russia. And, go back and look at the statements that have been made repeatedly by Lavrov and by the Kremlin spokesman and Maria Zakharova since 2024. They haven't varied from this at all. In fact, what has been said is that's the best deal you're going to get now. Differs quite, it's 180 degrees different from what was offered in March of 2022, when Donetsk and Luhansk could have stayed part of Ukraine. Russia was willing to sign off on that. They just wanted the guarantees for the Russian speakers, and they wanted NATO out. But Ukraine rejected it. So Russia said, okay, this is our new demand. Those 5. So Crimea as well stays with Russia. And they've now intimated, Putin has said basically, if we continue moving forward, then this additional territory we take, we'll give the people a chance to vote to see if they want to stay. I personally believe that before this is over, Russia will be in charge of Kharkiv, Sumy, Poltava, Nikolaev, and Odessa. They will take that, and Kiev. They will take all of that. And Kiev.
So you're saying if peace negotiations fail, that will be the outcome of the war?
Yes.
And you're assuming that we see the same amount of support from Europe and the US militarily?
Support from Europe and the US right now is irrelevant. What could they do? The United States and Europe combined cannot produce in a year the number of artillery shells that Russia is producing in 3 months. Not my words. Those are the words of Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General. The United States cannot produce the number of drones that Russia is producing. In fact, what the United States proposes to produce in a year, Russia's producing in a month. So, and then on top of it, the limitations are if the Chinese continue to withhold rare earth minerals, the U.S. is very constrained in the kind of weapons that it can produce.
What about if the U.S. supplies Tomahawk missiles?
Well, then they're going to escalate it to a possible nuclear conflict, because the Russians are going to have to think about it this way, Mario. Go back and try to total up the number of excuse, my dog is going crazy over
No,
something.
he's not that loud. Don't worry. He's not that loud.
Okay.
Don't worry.
Go back and total up the number of missiles and drones that, hang on, let me just holler at him.
Yeah, check him out. Yeah, all good. Don't worry. We can edit it out.
He's barking at some neighbor's dog.
That was quick. He listens to you very well.
Yeah,
that was impressive.
He obeys.
That was impressive.
He's a good Rottweiler. Go back and count up the number of missiles and drones that Russia has fired into Ukraine over the last now 42 months. I mean, it's an incredible number. There is no way that the West, if they gave everything they had to give, United States and all of Europe gave everything they had to give to Ukraine, that Ukraine could fire even 1/10 of what has been fired on Ukraine. Now, I point that out simply because, yes, Russia is attriting and destroying critical structures, but that destruction doesn't mean to lead to a total collapse. And Russia is in a far stronger position to resist what the West is trying to do than Ukraine is. Just think about these numbers. Because one of those 28 points that was pushed by Europe is that they want Ukraine to have an 800,000 man army. So the total population of the United Kingdom, France, and Germany right now is about 220 million. Their combined ground force between those three countries combined, less than 500,000. Ukraine's current population, 19 million. I mean, a fraction of the population of just those three European countries. And yet the Europeans want the Ukrainians to cough up 800,000 soldiers? The math doesn't work. They simply don't have. And this is what I'm saying. These guys, they are so out of touch with reality that they are into delusional proposals.
The last question for you, Larry, is what do you think of the new strategy? We've seen the sanctions. So they're trying to hit Russia's war chest rather than beat Russia on the battlefield. Trump's probably biggest move against Russia was the sanctions against Lukoil and Rosneft. Also the negotiations of the tariffs on India, pressuring India to cut Russian oil imports by about 50% by the end of the year. And then we now see Ukraine striking the Shadow Fleet, which is Russia's way to avoid the sanctions. I think they struck 2 or 3 or 4 now, I think, vessels. And then go back to the figures I gave you earlier by the IEA about Russia's oil revenue, the export revenue from fuel, dropping from by about $4 billion from November last year. Do you think that this strategy could at least pressure Russia to accept different terms, like freezing the lines in Zaporizhzhia and Kherson? Could economic pressure on Russia? Because again, I get different figures on how the Russian economy is performing. It's hard to really verify. But do you think that strategy could work for Ukraine?
Not at all. Zero. Go back and look at the how important oil exports are to the Russian economy. They now, the last I checked, they now account for about 15% of total GDP. Now, that's not insignificant, but it's not going to crush the Russian economy. The West continues to forget what it did to Russia in the 1990s. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the West had a chance to step in and help Russia maintain keep an economy alive and keep its people alive. Instead, the West said, we're going to watch the Russians die. That economy collapsed, literally collapsed for 9 years from 91 through about 99. You had the average life expectancy for men went from like 63 to 56. Oh, wow. You had an estimated 7 million additional deaths on top of what would be the normal deaths. People were working for months without getting paid. Professionals, credentialed professionals, couldn't get a job. Now, the Financial Times put out an article this last Sunday. I thought it was hilarious. It was by this economist. She's she's a Latvian economist, widely respected. And she said, "Yeah, the Russian economy is in trouble because they've had high inflation, but their growth rate is dropped because the central banker imposed measures to reduce inflation." Okay, so Russia took steps to reduce inflation, and then what? Well, wages. They have trouble employing people because they got 2.3% unemployment. So they're having trouble finding workers. Oh, okay. So you're saying you got an economy that's got plenty of jobs for everybody. Okay, what's the next problem? Well, the Russian wage growth, it grew 20%. Oh, okay. So the wage growth kept pace with inflation. Yeah. That's a problem? Well, yeah. So Russia's debt is rising. Yeah. What is Russia's current debt to GDP ratio? In fact, go on to Grok, Perplexity, ChatGPT, ask this question. Of all the industrial nations in the world, who has the lowest debt to GDP ratio? Russia. It's between 19 and 20%. United States debt to GDP ratio, 127% and growing. France, 115% and growing. England, now about 101% and growing. And these clowns are pretending that they can put enough economic pressure on Russia to say they're going to collapse in a heap, crying, "Oh my God, stop it, ease the pain." Russia's been through hell in the 1990s. They remember. The people haven't forgotten. It left as indelible a mark on the Russian soul as the Great Patriotic War, where they lost 27 million people. I spoke to there's actually an economist by the name of Galushka, and he comes out of Siberia. He's got the #1 selling book in Russia right now on the economy. And he told me, I had a conversation with him about 5 weeks ago. And he says, people in the West don't understand. We can build a wall around ourselves. We don't need a single import from anybody, including the Chinese. We can be self-sufficient and we'll get by fine. We'll have enough to feed ourselves. We've got all the natural minerals we need to produce what our consumer goods. But he says, we prefer to interact with the world. And that interaction, now they're turning south. And remember, 5 weeks ago, Bessent and the Trump administration were confident that, India, they're going to stop buying oil. And we kept hearing that. Then did you see when Putin just met with Modi last week? Couldn't have been a warmer meeting. They're talking about, in boosting trade relations, not cutting them back. The global South train has left the station and the West refused to get on. And that's the future of the world. The BRICS nations are charting a new world economic order that the West, in its arrogance, refuses to accept as reality. And we're going to find out the hard way.
Larry, absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for your time, sir.
Hey, Mario. Good to see you again. And to be
Pleasure's mine.